Well, so Glenn, you and I are here today just on an impromptu get together to talk about Wolfram's theories and just the whole idea of what is reality and what is computation and how those things all fit together. And I have lots of questions, but I also know you had some ideas that you wanted to talk about. So
yeah, well, there's been several of your video conversations which also touch on the same subject. So it seems like you're into the information and way of thinking. And then there was that interesting music video, that quirky one.
oh yeah,
And
Chris Petkau, he's doing some fascinating things.
yeah,
He's got this really interesting artistic eye and also musical. And for me, one of the interesting things that happens when I watch some of his little art pieces is that because my right brain gets distracted with all the visual and auditory elements that are going on, somehow my left brain is weaving the ideas, the intellectual ideas, in a different way than it does when I'm just reading or just listening to an academic video.
yeah, it's like the music catalyzes a way of thinking or something.
Yeah. Because
But
I mean, I used to notice that with my art. When I'm doing art, I like to put on something very academic because that keeps my left brain occupied so it doesn't get in my way and leaves my right hemisphere free to just kind of get into a flow state. But it works the other way too. And that would have never occurred to me if I hadn't watched his video.
Well, I really liked his title, A Symphony of Choices over time. I think that almost perfectly gets what I've been trying to get at, and he did a better job of it than I did. But I posted a comment there that really got me thinking about how we use language. And it's too long to post there, but I thought I wanted to just touch base here. Because we're talking about how a collection of instruments, each playing their own fixed piece of sheet music, which you can actually consider a kind of form of computation, and a set of choices over time governed by a set of rules. But somehow all of these instruments come together to make a symphony. Something new comes out of a whole collection of simple things. And I like that word symphony because it implies a more emotional, there's something richer there. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts, which is the hallmark of emergence, there's strong emergence. And I made a remark that in physics, we have language to talk about complexity, but we don't really have the words to talk about things that are simple. And so the ideas of choice and computation, I struggle to put them into words because in some ways it's very subtle, kind of a deep way of thinking. You've got to get into it. You can't just put it into words. And then I thought that might be an example of your reducible versus irreducible. When you can easily put things into words, that might be an indicator that you're dealing with something that's reducible. When you run into a situation where you struggle for the words, maybe that's an indication that you're bumping into the irreducible. And then I thought that's the purpose of the parables, the Jungian archetypes, or in Buddhism would be the koans. It's a way to put into words something that you can't otherwise just describe. And so I thought, and the flip side of irreducible is transcendent. So I could bounce those ideas, and I'm just thinking out loud on these, but I thought the connections were interesting.
Well, so I wanted to talk a little bit about your idea of the symphony, and I also like the title that Chris had chosen, A Symphony of Choices over time, because one of the things let me start by saying one of the things that I like about Wolfram's whole theory is not that I think that the universe is actually constructed that way. It could be, but I mean, that's not why I'm interested in it. I'm interested in it because the way he talks about the model gives me language to think about a lot of the other things that I've been thinking about.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of overlaps, a significant number of overlaps. So example, when you just said a symphony of choices over time, several things occur to me. One is I've also been reading Matthew Pajot's book, The Language of Creation. And in there, he has some very interesting ideas about the nature of space and time from a biblical perspective that kind of fold into what Wolfram is talking about in terms of the nature of space and time model. And the second thing is that time and choice play with each other in Wolfram's model. Okay, and let me just play something for you. I'm hearing some feedback from something kind of knocking around on your side. Is there anything touching anything?
The chair I'm sitting in?
Oh, no, I don't know. Okay, maybe, but there's two different places where he talks about choice and time. Let me just play a couple of clips here. And it is Wolfram.
Oh my.
No, I think it's on this one. Yeah, so just a minute. I got to stop share here and get the sharing thing right. I always forget to share sound. Okay. Now we got it. Okay.
So what it says is just do this, apply this rule wherever you feel like. And what is extremely non-trivial is, well, okay, so this is happening sort of in computer science terms, sort of asynchronously. You're just doing it wherever you feel like doing it. And the only constraint is that if you're going to apply the rule somewhere, the things to which you apply the rule, the little elements to which you apply the rule, if they have to be, okay, well, you can think of each application of the rule as being kind of an event that happens in the universe.
Yep.
And the input to an event has to be ready for the event to occur. That is, if one event occurred, if one transformation occurred, and it produced a particular atom of space, then that atom of space has to already exist before another transformation that's going to apply to that atom of space can occur.
So that's like the prerequisite for the event.
That's right. That's right. So that defines a kind of this sort of set of causal relationships between events. It says this event has to have happened before this event. Right. But that is.
But that's not a very limiting constraint.
No, it's not. And what's interesting,
you still get the zillion. That's a technical term. Options.
That's correct. But okay, so this is where things get a little bit more elaborate. But
they're mind blowing. So
right. But so what happens is, so the first thing you might say is, So this question about the freedom of which event you do when. Well, let me sort of state an answer and then explain it. Okay, the validity of special relativity is a consequence of the fact that in some sense it doesn't matter in what order you do these underlying things, so long as they respect this kind of set of causal relationships.
So, and that's the part.
So I'm going to stop here for a second and ask you a question about that. When he's talking about causal invariance, and he says it doesn't matter in which order you do these things, as long as you respect the order of causal relationships. Who is the respecter there? He's not, I mean, many times so I wrote down a few places where he's inconsistent. because sometimes he talks as though in one of his videos, he says, you know, if there is a creator who started all of this, he doesn't deserve any special credit because he could have picked any rule and the universe would have come out of that. But then other times he talks like this, where he says, it doesn't matter in what order you do this updating, as long as you respect the order of this causal order of causal relationships.
Mhm.
So who's doing the respecting? And if there is some entity doing the respecting of this order of causal relationships, then that certainly means an entity that is computationally irreducible to us, a transcendent being of unimaginable scope.
Not necessarily, but you're still, yeah. You're
Okay,
in the
so
right
not
direction.
necessarily. So tell me, how could that not necessarily be?
One of the fundamentals of his thinking is that a few simple rules can give rise to infinite levels of complexity.
Mm-hmm.
But he never explains how that happens. Somewhere in there has to be a computer running the rules. And that's where I don't know, disagreement is a harsh word, but I think he's missing some pieces. His math, he's not doing his mathematical due diligence as he's developing his theory.
Okay, but let me say this. In some places he says, well, first of all, he says it's running all possible rules in all possible ways that those rules could run. And in other places, he talks about one simple rule. Okay, so that's one area. Another thing he talks about is that sometimes he talks about the universe itself being a Turing machine. And other places he talks about all possible Turing machines running all possible rules.
Yeah.
But he, in the most recent one I listened to, he talks about he was putting out a thought experiment, a thought bubble to Lex Fridman, and he was talking about what if it were just one simple Turing machine running around updating wherever the input is ready, the update happens, and for those of us who are observers, the reason that we don't see anything off about that is that until we're updated, we can't observe the other updates that have been done. So we're always, whenever we're updated, everything has already been updated around us. So it all looks perfectly normal. When he talked about that very simple Turing machine just running around doing all the updating, that made me think about, I think it was Feynman that had the idea of just one photon that's the whole.
I'm not sure it was Feynman, but yeah, that was floating around years ago.
Yeah.
Just one electron and it's just going back and forth in time.
Yeah. So other times he doesn't say the universe is a Turing machine. He just says the universe is computational. So if it's just computational, then it needs something to run on, right? But if it is the computer itself in his thinking, right, then it doesn't need anything else.
Yeah. So to answer your questions, well, I have to dive into his math and start from scratch, and I haven't. That's still a task ahead of me. If you find disagreement in somebody's arguments, your first obligation is to go in and try and steel man their arguments, try and fix what you think is wrong, or in some sense, he's obviously more brilliant than I am. So I need to go in and spend time trying to see things the way he sees them, so I can figure out why I'm seeing something different. But the stumbling block for me is nowhere is it discussed what is doing the computation. Before a computation or the rules sets or anything can take on a physical reality, there has to be a physical computational system that's playing by the rules and generating the output. And so I would go back and I say, okay, where in your theory, it should be right from the very beginning, there should be some way to create that the physical computational structure, which means atoms and molecules, and his theory sort of just leapfrogs past that up into a very complex area.
Well, he starts out by saying that space is just composed of atoms of space. And those atoms of space that's all there is. There is no matter except those atoms of space. And we are all part of that structure. And that all starts out with one very simple relationship of atoms of space, this, like 1 point. And then from that, all of space begins to grow. So space is at any given point in the causal relationships of what he calls time, then space has a certain size. Space continues to expand, which is the expanse of space over time. The expanse of space through updating events is what he calls time. And it's what leads the arrow. He talked about the arrow of cosmological time being related to entropy and the expansion of space. And that's why there's an arrow of cosmological time.
I feel like he's gotten ahead of himself. Because before any two atoms of space can talk to each other, there has to be a rule set that governs that conversation. So every atom of space has to be, in some sense, a state machine. And then atoms, molecules, everything can be envisioned as a cellular automatons that live on that fabric of space and time. That's, I think, the missing element. And if he goes there, then that really constrains his thinking a lot and gets it back down to something that looks more like physical reality. I think that's a hard one to communicate, I think, because I've sort of lived with it, with the Maxwell's demon problem. And it finally sunk in with dealing with Maxwell's demon, that if you want to answer that satisfactorily in physics, you have to somehow include the demon into the physics of the whole problem. And then you have to ask, well, where does the demon come from? And what makes the demon? And that's the kind of the place where I think words run out. The textbook stuff we learn in physics, the equations, the definitions, all of a sudden don't really work at that level. What do you mean by information? There's no good useful definition for that, actually. What do you mean by observation in physics? Because every measurement that we make of our world around us involves quantum mechanics. And so the whole very notion of measurement, observation is a quantum mechanical problem. And as yet, there is no satisfactory answer as what the measurement is in quantum mechanics either. So I think that's what I see when I look at Stephen Wolfram's stuff, is that there's this background of fundamental questions I bring with me, and I'm looking for, okay, where do these come into your theory, Stephen? And I don't see them popping up. And then it leaves me feeling a little bit uneasy, like things aren't quite complete yet. There's parts missing. So hopefully that makes sense.
Well, yeah, it does. But if I could get back to this whole thing about so what I'm hearing you say is that you feel uncomfortable talking about the complexities of the theory without the theory having a foundational,
a good grounding that I'm confident about.
Okay, but still, let me ask you this question.
Okay.
In the video that he does on how universal are numbers, I don't know if you watched that one, but he's talking to a bunch of mathematicians about whether numbers are a function of the way the universe is set up, or whether they're just a function of the way that we observe our particular slice of the universe. And
is there a difference?
yes, in
Are there
his,
two?
I mean, in his
thinking, yeah.
in his thinking there is, because, well, let me tell you what he said. He said, when the particular slice that we look at that makes time happen for us is that we're looking at a causal chain. We're looking at a chain of events that's moving through the universe. One thing happens before another thing, you know, and then another thing happens after that thing, and something can't happen until the updating has been done so that it's prepared for the next move. It's kind of like what you and I were talking about, the difference between thinking of our future as a series of branching events, or whether thinking about our future as being more like a vine that can divide and merge again, right? So we imagine time to be a certain way because of the way we observe that chain of causal events. And in a sense, and Jonathan Gorard talks about this too, that each observer has a unique perspective of this thing because the slice that they're seeing is slightly different than any other observer. So what he went on to say was that what you need to turn a sequence into time is that choice. What series of slices of events will be considered to be simultaneous in order to make this a chain rather than just a graph of random events? What series of those events are you going to choose to look at? And then the guy who had asked him the question said, that's a deeply Kantian statement. And then Wolfram said, you know, I have to confess, I haven't read enough philosophy. I need to go back and read more philosophy.
I tried to read Kant when I was in college and I gave up. He takes a book to say what I think you could say in like 2 or 3 paragraphs.
Well, I've never read Kant, so I wouldn't have any idea. But my note on this was that this seems to imply that time, that in his perspective, time is a function of a consciousness that chooses a particular thread of events.
I'll buy that.
Yeah, I mean, that just seems to me to be what he's saying. I don't know how you can get out of that. Another thing that he said that I thought was so interesting, maybe I should play this. It's in the numbers one, and it's at 141.25. I don't know why I'm so bad at this. It's how universal are numbers, 141.25. There's so many, you know, the thing that makes him so captivating to listen to is he's got so much output. You could spend your whole life listening to this guy.
Well, I sort of have a blank screen right now, so.
Oh, I wonder why. Huh. So you're not seeing this?
No, I see a menu bar on the side for font and spacing, but that's it.
Oh, so somehow, let's stop sharing and share again. Is that better?
Yeah, got it now.
Okay. I don't know why it did that. I think sometimes if there's some documents up that they're masking something. But now this is a dead video. It's so weird.
Yeah, I watched part of this and then I realized that I need to go back and do my homework. because my exposure to introduction of arithmetic out of set theory and math logic, I need to correlate what he's doing with how I learned it in the textbooks. Because you start with set, math logic and then set theory, and then you get to numbers and arithmetic. And then you get to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So, but numbers don't just appear. There are several steps into the abstract creation of the world of mathematics. So I need to go back and figure out how that works into his theory, or how his thinking correlates, like I say, with what I got from my textbooks years ago.
This particular video is 3 hours long, so
Yeah.
I have to get ready to slog. But I can't get the video to play, but here's what he says. I'll just read the transcript. He's talking about doing proofs in mathematics.
Mhm.
And he says this is sort of a minimalist version of proving. So there's an axiom system here. It defines a bunch of relations, and we're proving a theorem. This is the proof of the theorem. It's this path from one expression to another. So we can imagine there can be multiple proofs of this theorem, this story of sort of all, given axiom systems, we're defining a set of rules for transforming expressions, or equivalently transforming propositions from ones that are equivalent. That defines this network. And so this network is actually one of these multi-way graphs, just the same as the kind of thing that we're talking about in physics. And here's my speculation. I'm not sure it's quite right, but so a proof is a path in this graph.
Mhm.
Say that this is equal to, there's a proof of that which corresponds to this path. So one way you can find out what's equal to what is by just explicitly finding these parts that sort of are a proof theoretic way to do it. Another thing you could do is to imagine foliating this graph, making something that is like a reference frame where you make this graph in layers. And then this question is this thing connected to this other thing? Becomes a question of sort of looking at what layers it's in. So in a sense, what that's doing is the claim would be the reference frame in the multi-way graph corresponding to the models of model theory. So what I get out of this is that he is saying that, because I have a very simple mind. So to me, this is just saying the proof is the path. So the path that we take in life, in a sense, proves whether or not we are on the correct path. Right? So
Yeah.
you take a certain path, and at the end of the path, if you end up in the place where you had hoped to be, then you have proved
Mhm.
your original intention. Another way you could say faith is the substance of things hoped for.
Yeah.
You have a hope, and at the end of it, there's a substance, and faith gets you from one to the other. And if you get there, then you have faith, because
Mhm.
you arrived at the substance of the thing that you were hoping for. And that's the same way as now, is that necessarily the way that people look at mathematical proofs, or is he looking at it in a new way?
No, that's standard. That you can see a chain of statements and rules for making new statements from old statements.
Mhm.
I think that's classic math logic. But what I noticed was, as soon as he uses the term layers, he's introduced 3D world into the problem. At the level he's working at, there is no three-dimensional space time.
Oh,
And
no,
so-
I think he is talking about three-dimensional.
Yeah,
Because
but that
he's
at that
not
level of
using-
mathematics,
He's
he
not
hasn't-
using cellular automata.
No, but to imagine that these chains are taking place in layers and then try and visualize it that way, you've already brought something into the math, which isn't really in the math yet.
Oh, I see what you're saying, just mathematically.
Yeah, so a lot of
But
his work
inside
is,
his head,
that's
there-
how he's visualizing it.
Yeah, because when he talks about this issue of causal invariance, and he did that a lot in the Lex Fridman number 124, when he talks about the multi-way Rullial graph of implementing all possible rules in all possible ways at every updating event, that's happening all the time. All possible rules are being applied in all possible ways at every updating event, which produces this universe of obviously infinite complexity. But because of his picture of causal invariance, any observer within, and all observers are within the system, that's the key thing. Any observer within that system has a choice of what foliation or what layer or what slice of that system that they're going to see. And so they're basically choosing their own timeline. They're choosing their own picture of how this universe functions. But because of causal invariance, if you take all of those observers together and put all these layers back together, what you have is this universe, which made me think, because I have a very simple mind, it made me think back to the very first conversation I ever had with Paul Vanderklay, when I was saying to him that it looked to me, with my very pea brain, that every domain of knowledge, let's say chemistry or biology or physics, has an internal consistency within its own domain. And in the universe, there's also an infinite amount more that could be said about that domain of knowledge that can be discovered out there in the universe. So in a sense, each of them is a complete picture, but they actually all stack up together to make another complete picture. They're all united. And that's kind of what I hear him saying, is that physics looks at a certain slice of this multi-way Rullial graph, and biology looks at a different slice of it. And as humans, we're looking at the slice of it that makes sense to us in trying to live our lives.
Well, I can't quite go there yet with you, but there's a lot, the mathematician in me needs to go back and fill in the hole, so to speak. Stephen Wolfram is really a physicist. I really get that sense that he does a lot of computation, but he thinks like a physicist. And there's kind of a joke way to look at it is, a physicist uses mathematics. It's like watching someone pound in nails with a crescent wrench. If you get a big enough crescent wrench and you practice, you can do okay with it, but it's not the right tool for the job. Physicists get away with a lot of bad mathematics because the intuition saves them. Somehow the physicists tend to have an intuition that gets them past all of the bad mathematics so that they end up with a good answer in the end anyway. So I'm not going to come out and say that I think Stephen's wrong or right. There's a lot of missing pieces in there that the mathematician in me wants to fix and make sense of before I come back and give you an answer on these kind of questions.
Well, so do you know what an Infinity Groupoid is?
Not right off.
Oh, okay. Because at one point in one of his conversations, he says that one of the things that he had discovered was that the picture that his theory draws of the universe is identical to, I forget the guy's name, some very complicated Dutch name, I think, Grothenstein, something like that. His Infinity Groupoid. But then in other places, I mean, he talks a lot about how he doesn't know much about category theory. He doesn't know much about set theory. And so I thought those were all things that mathematicians had some sort of a handle on, at least. So
Yeah, I have textbooks on all that stuff sitting on my shelf that have been collecting dust for like 20 or 30 years. So I need I know it's out there, but I'm not ready to dive or say anything.
I think there's too much inside every domain of knowledge for anybody to have even a tiny speck of it inside their own brains.
But one thing that worries me about Stephen is I think he's launched with a good idea. There's a solid foundation somewhere in there. He's made an oversight that physics has been making since at least maybe the 50s and the original electroweak theory. And it's really come home now with string theory. And I wanted to pass that by you. That when they bring two theories together, when they unite electromagnetism and the weak nuclear force, that was, these aren't necessarily my ideas. I picked them up along the way, and it's probably happened before. But to take two mathematical models and then create a greater mathematical model that contains the two together, you always end up making a more complex mathematical system that's now complex enough to contain each, like electromagnetism and the weak nuclear, as special cases. But whenever you do that mathematically, you end up with a whole bunch of other possibilities, or maybe an infinite number of solutions besides the ones you want.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the case of the electroweak, and then the same pattern happens with the standard model. You create this overarching Uber theory mathematical model. Now, how do you dial down to get to the physical reality you want? In those two cases, physics was lucky because the variation from one model to the next was based on parameters, numerical parameters, which you could actually go to the particle accelerator, run experiments. You get the numbers experimentally, you put them back into your theory, your mathematical model, and then it dials everything down and you get some pretty good results now. But now you've ended up with these free parameters, and then you get into the problem of what they call fine tuning. Is the physics, you have a model like the standard model that is mathematically complex enough to contain the three forces that we know as special cases, but the only way you can get it is by having, I think maybe a couple dozen, thereabouts, I'm not sure, of these parameters that you have to measure. And then you get it, you dial it in, and you get. But every time you notice, when you create an Uber theory by combining simpler theories into a bigger combined theory, you end up with a lot of solutions that you have to figure out how to throw away. And then you get into the problem of fine tuning. Now with string theory, they're in the same boat, but the difference between all of the theories is not one of numerical. String theory doesn't make predictions you can go into the lab and measure and then fine tune your theory it's all geometric. And so there's no way to collapse string theory down to the reality we want. So you end up with these infinite number of solutions with no way to select out the right ones because there's no, string theory doesn't make a prediction. And I think Eric Weinstein, and there's a couple others, names that escape me. And I'm afraid my gut sense is telling me that Stephen Wolfram is kind of falling into the same mistake, that he's enamored by the fact that his modeling, his computer simulations are producing a lot of structures that look like things you see in physics. But in the process, you create a lot of things that maybe aren't. And I would look in his theory, where's the filtering mechanism that will pull his theory back to what we see physically in physical reality. And again, I'm not picking up where that might be, but then I haven't dove into his theory. So,
well, yeah, it would seem to me that there will always be an easy out on that.
Yeah.
Because because he says, and I think this is true, that the universe is fundamentally computationally irreducible.
Yeah, I buy that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if the universe is fundamentally computationally irreducible, and the slices of it that are computationally reducible are only those slices where we choose particular observations to do that look to us to have predictive possibility. And so we choose those slices, and then we confine our investigation in those slices in such a way that we can get certain predictions.
Mhm.
And so it's only from our perspective as observers that we're able to find these pockets of computational reducibility.
Mhm.
Now, if we were actually talking about the way the universe is constructed, and the computationally irreducible one is the transcendent, and he's giving us as a gift, I think, this little pocket of irreducibility, of reducibility, where we can play around and make discoveries and all of that.
Yeah.
But if we're just speaking abstractly, he could always say there's no way to predict where this is going because the universe is fundamentally computationally irreducible. So he doesn't need to have predictive capacity in his theory. Although I think what he's using as normative is the discoveries that he's making of where certain other theories fall out of his picture.
Yeah.
Piece by piece. And so he's using those as proofs, so to speak, of that he's going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. But like my opinion, for what it's worth, and is that he's falling into the same trap that physics has been stuck in for the last maybe 70 plus years. That you create this overarching theory which has a whole bunch of possibilities, but with some parameters that you can, if you pick them just right, then the theory generates the outcome you want. So he's created this thing that looks a lot like a lot of things in physics. And so he's excited because he's seeing the patterns come out of his theory. But he might fall into the same trap that string theory fell into, is that there's no way to select out of all of the possibilities the ones that you want. There's no filtering mechanism there. Whereas the alternative is to start, don't try and build the Uber theory. Start with something that will grow. And as each layer each layer comes from the layer below. And rather than start from the big picture and try and come back down. And that's where you get strong emergence, is the observation that simple things can give rise to a little more complex things. Those complex objects can now become things, individuals in their own right, which then gives rise to the next layer up. So
I thought that's what he was doing. So
I sort of thought that's why I was enamored with his work at first, but then the more I dive into it, the less that it seems like that's what he's doing.
So where's the disconnect?
I don't know. I guess that's my homework project for the next.
No, but I mean, what makes you think? So if he's starting from one simple rule, I mean, his pictures always start with the simple rule up here and it goes out like this, but you could as easily say the simple rule is down here and it's growing up this way, right?
Simple rule has to give rise to the computational mechanism, which then generates the next rule set. The rule set has to run on some kind of computational system. But once you've got that going.
Well, okay, so let me ask you a very personal question. Isn't it okay? Is it okay for me? Maybe it's okay for me because I'm not a physicist, but to me, if you have God, why do you need a computer? God can run the rule any way that he wants. He can run the rule.
I know. And so Stephen Wolfram's in the kind of position that, well, the universal computer running everything must be God, though he doesn't walk there, but that's sort of implicit in what he's doing. And so you kind of go, Steve, but John Archibald Wheeler with his It from Bit, which has spawned the whole industry of black hole entropy, and made the observation that information becomes physical when it's observed. And I thought to myself, okay, Steve, John Wheeler, he's a big atheist. So you need a universal observer to make things happen. So isn't that kind of like God? But the physics people don't go there. And it's like others have commented that if you're going to make speculations at fundamental levels in physics, you sort of are obligated at that point to start to take your ideas to their absolute logical conclusion. And so,
So I think that's why he wants to talk to some theologians.
Mhm.
Now, here's one theologian that I found that sounds exactly like Stephen Wolfram. His name is Father Robert Spitzer, and he's in the Society of Jesuits.
Uh-huh.
And he says, absolute simplicity is power without intrinsic or extrinsic restrictions. And then he says, unrestricted reality is perfect simplicity in perfect unity. Now, to me, that's exactly the picture of the beginning of Wolfram's universe,
Mhm.
is unrestricted reality, perfect simplicity in perfect unity. And then he says, nothing is only the result of our reflecting on what is outside the bound of finite reality.
But that's a fundamental question in physics: is where did physicists come from? So
Where did physicists come
from? Yeah. He's sort of, Stephen's in the same book.
You mean like you're all
The
aliens?
rule set and everything, but who's doing the observing? What is doing the rule processing? And it's like he's
Well, maybe that's why it makes sense to me when I
implied.
listen, because to me, of course, it's God who's
Mhm.
To me, of course, I've talked to you before about my one simple rule idea, that if the simple rule is love, then every choice at every juncture of every event, the choice is love, is towards love.
Mhm.
So that's the simple rule that makes the universe. And it, even the picture that he draws of the three elements that are conjoined by three causal edges,
Mhm.
which then at every updating changes it, or is it one connected to three, but at every updating it switches into the other one.
Mhm.
That looks very much to me like relationship, like the relationship of the Trinity before the beginning of time. And
But somebody or something has to come along and do the switching. So it's like the DNA strand is just a memory. It's a magnetic tape. The DNA it takes the little RNA protein molecules to read the memory, and then takes that information to create new molecules. So now the RNA elements are more state machines. They're like a finite state automata that then read the memory, and then the RNA just blindly follows its own internal rules and takes the DNA information and turns it into new proteins. So before you have a turning machine, there has to be state machines.
Now I understand where your problem is, because you've said before that that physical reality, that a program can instantiate physical reality,
Mhm.
right? So, but that means that we're actually looking at physical reality, but we're looking at physical reality that has been instantiated from, you could call it a program, you could call it an idea, you could
Mhm.
call it a plan, okay, has instantiated physical reality. So in Wolfram's picture, he doesn't really have room for for information or a plan or a program, because everything is just that one simple rule running all the time, and not really instantiating any physical reality. I mean, like, for example, let me see if I can get my screen to share this. There is this right here. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to see Wolfram's theory explain where something like this comes from.
Right.
Right? This is the cellular and molecular processes in our metabolic pathways. So, I mean, there are obviously some things missing.
Well, that was our original talk about the origins of life, is can you find a simpler version of that that's non-biological that you could bootstrap up from to get there. A lot of the protein folding actually is a computer without memory. Remember we talked about that, the parking meter? There are computational systems that don't have memory, the key in the lock. So some of those blindly just follow a set of rules built into them by the way they're constructed. So you take a dumb computer without memory, which is a finite state machine, and then you give it a memory strip, like the DNA, to read, and all of a sudden, if you pick the rules right, the thing starts to self-reproduce. To me, that's kind of magic that you can play that game. But there has to be something in there making the code, which is the rules in the DNA, and turning it into physical reality so that we can exist, so we can actually sit here and talk about it. There had to be a whole process happen between the rule set and us. That's what I sense is missing.
Mm-hmm.
If we could,
yeah, in his conversation with Lex Fridman, he talks about how. So he talks about how we're just sort of a little foam that's on top of this whole structure of space and time, and then so when I was reading some stuff about his book, A New Kind of Science, he makes the comment that we are not special. I think I actually have a document of that I could show you. Somewhere. Let me just see if I can find it. And before I forget, one of the other things he talks about a lot is the whole knitting of space and time together.
that's a fundamental question, I think, that needs to be really worked on.
The knitting of space and time together?
Right. But
yeah, I can't find it. I must have closed it down, but it's oh, this is that very interesting Schoenfinkel thing, combinators. I've been looking at too many things, but I think it's in the Wikipedia thing from.
yeah, it's just blank screen right now for me.
Oh, okay. I don't know why this isn't showing up, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. I need to learn how to do all those things. When he's talking about, now I lost my thread. What were we just talking about? His new kind of science.
Mm-hmm.
I completely lost the thread.
One of the things I've noticed is he doesn't want to talk about strong emergence. And I don't know if he does that on purpose, because it is kind of a dicey subject in the physics and math realm.
Well, has
Or
somebody
if-
asked him about it?
I don't know. I have not had the chance to dive into his work that deep.
Yeah, I mean, I've listened to lots and lots of Q&As, and I haven't heard anybody ask about that.
Mhm.
In the Q&As that he does for kids, sometimes they will ask biological questions, and then he starts answering.
Yeah.
And when he starts answering these biological questions, and I can almost see the wheels moving in his head, because as he gets further, and he's trying to answer it in a very simple way about these biological processes.
Mhm.
And then it gets more and more and more complex as he goes. And you can almost imagine that the wheels are moving up there like, how did this all really happen? Is this all really just an accident, you know? Yeah, he's a very interesting guy. I mean, he's very full of himself in a lot of ways. He's always wanting to tell everybody what he's done and what he's discovered. And
Mhm.
I tried to watch the episode between Wolfram and on the Brian Keating Into the Impossible, between Wolfram and Eric Weinstein.
Mhm.
And Wolfram just won't let Eric Weinstein get a word in edgewise.
Yeah.
It's really sad, you know,
Mhm.
because I'd like to hear Weinstein's ideas and then compare them to Wolfram's ideas, but you can't really get there.
Yeah. Well, one of these days, maybe.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I think the way I do is like I said, you know, vocationally, I was a hardware designer in Silicon Valley. So my world is very hands-on. You know, if it's isn't silicone, copper, and soldering, I'm not. That's where I'm more comfortable. There's one great quote. There's Bob Pease was a great analog designer of note, and he always said his favorite programming language was solder, and that's kind of the world I fall into. So that tends to
So
guide
why
my
is
thinking.
that? Why would that be his favorite programming language? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Because you don't know how things are going to work until you build it. And there's the old saying that in theory is a lot like practice, but in practice it isn't. And I've bumped heads many times in design issues. Is that people will design things on paper, and then I'll come back and I'll say something like, "No, that's not going to work," and they'll go, "Why?" And I'll try and explain. And it's like, and they don't get it. And
Mhm.
one of the observations in the industry over there when I was there is that you get hired as a hardware designer not for what you know how to do, but for the 101 ways of that things won't work. So one of the jokes, I don't know now because I've been out of the field, but you could always tell the hardware guy if you went into a startup company because he was the older guy with the beard. And it takes years of working, doing stuff to get the background you need to actually do hardware. And my job was taking notes on scratch paper and then turning them into something that you could actually work and run. And that's where I see that pattern of choices over time based on a rule set, that you can go from ideas and end up with a product that ends up going out for sale. And in my case, I did medical design and medical device stuff for a while. So people would come in with an idea, sometimes doctors, and say, well, if we just had something that could do this or that, we could help certain patients. And then I did embedded computers. So if a medical device had to have a little embedded processor in it to make it work, that's where I would come in. And then you get to go in and put on scrubs and actually see some of your stuff you've designed being used on people. It was kind of satisfying to take that route. But to me, taking an idea and watching it turn into physical reality is kind of magic. and watch the pattern of choices happen.
That's what my
Yeah.
husband always says too. That's what makes his job so exciting, is that he gets to see things come into reality that never would have existed if it hadn't been for an idea, right?
And then the funny thing I would say, well, at a certain point, the hardware starts to talk to you. It kind of tells you what it wants to be. And then there's the idea from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. There's that quality. Somehow we are sensing as we go through the design process, Symphony of Choices over time, what is it we're picking up on that guides our choices down to something that ends up working? And we're picking up on something. I, as an engineer or an artist, a dancer like you, people who design the motorcycle, the Honda 305, which is the motorcycle from the Zen book. What is it they were thinking when the design came together that made it just work? Because I had a 305 when I was younger, and I rode it everywhere for a couple of years, and it was a nice solid piece of engineering. There's something going on, and I often wondered if that's how we experience strong emergence, top-down causality. Some of your talks, they talked about when you listen to music, or context. We talk about how context is important in understanding things. Maybe context is, again, top-down causality. We sense something at that irreducible level above us. Even though something is irreducible, and we live in a reducible world below it. We're able to sense that next layer out, and it guides us in our thinking.
Well, let's take that all the way down to the particle layer, because one of the things that Wolfram said that I thought was, probably everybody already knew this, but to me it was kind of a revelation, that particles like electrons, or let's just say quarks, they're all the same. All the quarks are the same, regardless what they're in. The difference is, I think he said, the direction, the spin, and the momentum. There are three things that differentiate one quark from another.
Quark, well, there's color as well.
Okay, but color doesn't really mean color.
No.
It's just yeah. But the point is, whatever it is that differentiates one quark from another, and how it ends up getting used, maybe used as too much of an agent loaded word, but where a quark ends up, or how, what it is a part of, depends on the context, right? So everything depends on context. And so then you have to ask, where does context come from? Because otherwise everything would just be completely undifferentiated.
Yep.
So this is one of the things I found so fascinating about Matthew Pageau's concept of time and space. Because he says, and in saying this, Wolfram is in complete agreement with what Matthew Pageau says, and that is that space is made up of discrete parts. But time, in Pageau's view, is continuous. And so he alludes to the idea that time is more related to chaos and space is more related to order. And the fact that time is continuous means that it's not differentiable. There's no stopping points. And when I was reading the book, it became pretty clear to me that part of the problem with the way people are starting to think nowadays about things like that there is no gender binary, that it's all just this continuous fluid series of potential genders that can be there. That's the problem with this continuity, where there are no stopping points, where no choices have to be made. Right. Because in space, in order for there to be order, choice has to be made, but choice requires that there be stopping points.
Right.
Like photons are discrete, right? there has to be differentiable points. And when you're looking at all the quarks in the universe, all the standard model particles, they're not differentiable except for context. And so context is what separates them out. In a sense, I can kind of understand that in Wolfram's model, because when he starts talking about how all these atoms of space get built out as this hypergraph, multi-rullial, multi-way thing gets grown, then they're each in their own context within this whole thing.
Yeah.
And each one has a specific context, and that context is made up of what the causal relationships are with everything around it. So there's, what I'm coming to is that there are certain things that are basic units of reality, and one of those is context, one of them is relationship, one of them is proportion. Where you land on the continuum is an issue of a choice of proportion. And value is like that, because value says, I'm moving from A to B, I'm moving from here to there because there seems like it's better than here. That's the only reason I'm moving there. So that better point, that value point, choices have to be made. Sometimes you can't always have the best value. You have to make some other choice that's slightly less than best.
Yeah,
some
stochastic process, random walk, biased.
Yeah, because other things enter into the decision-making process, right? Or obstacles get in the way. So there has to be some place along the way where you can choose something that's not the ultimate, which I think is why Peterson says that while you're on the way, you have to have this vision of the ultimate good as a guide star, because you can't always choose the ultimate good in every choice that you make moving forward. But that guide star is always there to kind of keep you on this quality path.
And I would go that guide star sits in the next level up of irreducible complexity someplace. And somehow, in order for it to communicate down to you, it has to cross that threshold back. And that's where the role of archetypes, the stories, the parables, somehow they tell us a higher truth. We're able to put into words a higher truth that we couldn't otherwise explain. And that's how we get our guide stars. Anyway, yeah, it's riffing a little more on a symphony of choices over time. I got thinking that would be a good way to describe the Old Testament scriptures. It's a compilation of stories that over time create a symphony. And I think that's what Jordan Peterson gets. And I could say, Jordan Peterson hears the music, he hears the symphony, whereas his conversation partners like Sam Harris or recently Lawrence Krauss, they can't.
Although I have to give some kudos to Krauss that when he hosted Jordan Peterson on his podcast, he asked some really good questions that made Peterson talk about things he hasn't talked about before, or talk about them in a new way.
But I got frustrated with Lawrence.
Yeah, he is a little frustrating, but he did ask some good questions, and for the most part, he did listen. So, do you think that Peterson and Wolfram could have a generative conversation? Or would you rather hear him talk to Walton? What is that guy's name? John Walton?
Oh, that's a different. That would be interesting. But the one I'd really be curious of is Jordan Peterson and Nima, Arkani Hamed.
Oh yeah, I've been pushing that on every comment thread I can
They might just
find.
sit there and stare at each other. I don't know. Or it might get really interesting. Either way.
Well, I'm not sure with all of these. I'm not sure that either one of them would be able to draw the connection about why they have an interesting connection. we know because we're looking from the outside in,
Yeah,
listening to both of them, and we have our own picture of what it's all about. And so we know where the connection is. It's in his concept of truth, right?
right.
But if Nima just started talking about particle physics and string theory and all that, I'm
Yeah,
not sure there would be a whole lot of connection there.
but Nima Arkani Hamed is one of the few physicists who's not afraid of the anthropic principle. He's not afraid of that, to talk about religious things, which that might be an opening for him.
Have you heard him talk about those things anywhere else besides in that one lecture?
Not the question of morality that he brought up. And I could tell by the way he's talking, by his voice, that he was very uncomfortable giving that one. But he does talk about naturalism in physics, and he does touch on fine-tuning, anthropic principle, stuff like that. So that comes up in other lectures that if you hunt around, you can find. Unfortunately, most of his lectures, you need a graduate level background in physics to just get through half of them.
Yeah, I mean, I was reaching my capacity just on his theory on the I can never remember if it's the fundamental morality of physics or the fundamental
Morality of fundamental physics,
morality of
theoretical physics. But on a completely different note, you want to dive into John Walton?
Yes,
Because I believe that was Paul Onleitner.
Yes,
He talked about, he brought that up at about the 45-minute mark in his talk.
Well,
and I was going, yeah, somebody.
Let's see if I can get my share screen to work.
My first exposure.
I'm going to have to go at it through your email because otherwise, many years. And I wanted to know what you meant when you said it, the shape of reality. Can you hear it?
So a lot of my thinking in this regard is shaped by John Walton's work, the Old Testament scholar, probably most well known for he's at Wheaton University, most well known for his like Lost World series, Lost World of Genesis, Lost World of Adam and Eve, Lost World of the Flood. Walton's work on Genesis 1, even into Genesis 2 and 3, is about helping us think through Genesis, the two creation narratives, because they are really two narratives in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3. They're telling stories about creation, but they're focused on different things. For Walton, the story is really about.
You could probably cut out any time.
Okay.
We need to think.
Now, have you listened to any Walton?
Oh, yes, a lot.
Okay.
I actually became familiar with John Walton before I ran into Jordan Peterson. He came out here to Santa Cruz years ago to speak. And that's when I first encountered him. And I was just completely excited by his talk, because I've been bothered, as someone who's in physics and trying to deal with the creation story. There's the problem of religion and science, and it's a nut you can't crack. But John Walton's take, it's the first time I've heard someone approach the understanding using things like Jungian archetypes. So I've often wondered if Jordan Peterson was familiar with John Walton's work. But a lot of people have assumed that if they can deal with the question of origins of life, evolution, that would get over the hump with making the biblical story compatible with science. So I think there's BioLogos, which is a website which has been pushing that a lot. Evolutionary creationism. But in physics, I realized that the second law of thermodynamics is what kills you. There's no way that you can make the creation story as it's read today as a physics or a story, a science story, make sense, because physics, the second law will come back and get you. So even if you can explain evolution somehow, it doesn't satisfy. John Walton's take is that the creation story is not a science story, and it should not be read that way. And it was excited because if you don't have to read the Genesis creation story as a science story, that really gets us Christians out of a lot of trouble.
Well, I mean,
And
science as it exists today didn't even exist as a,
no, so
a gleam in anybody's eye back then, right?
mhm. So his take, and it's a word he uses a lot, was that we have to remember Scripture was written for us, but not to us. And so we're accustomed to looking at the New Testament, reading it in terms of the original classic Greek, and in terms of the context of the times. That makes perfect sense to us. So the fundamental question, why don't we read the Old Testament that way? And I think John Walton's, one of his specialties is ancient Hebrew. And so he was going back and looking at, if I was to give the Cliff Notes, the creation story in terms of the ancient Hebrew as the words were used at the time, and in the context of how people saw the world around them at the time. And when you do that, you get a completely different story than we read it today. And so he got a lot of pushback, and probably still does, from the Christian community. And it was sad because in some ways, Jordan Peterson came along and has given somewhat the same message to the secular community, and he's been warmly welcomed. So I hope I encourage some of your listeners to go listen to John Walton. So on that note, I guess that's about as much as I have to say.
Yeah, we've kind of come full cycle.
Yeah.
I'm going to show you something. This is all the questions that I had for you.
Oh my.
So we're going to have to get together again sometime. Or
I'll
what
just scan
I
it and
really
email
need
it to
to
me.
do is write this stuff down and make some orderly sense of it, because I just have, it's very difficult to do research when you're limited to these YouTube conversations, because you don't have the text unless you take the time to make a transcription, which is horribly time consuming. Even if you take the transcription from even if you take the transcription from the video itself, you have to get all the timestamps out just so you can make sense of what they're talking about. And it's just way too much time. So then you have to keep notes of, well, he said this on this particular video at this particular timestamp, and it's just all over the place. It's very hard to make anything coherent out of it. But, you know, over time, the picture is getting filled out in my head, so I have a better picture of what he's talking about and where some of the inconsistencies are, but also where some of the really beautiful images are that captivate my thinking, just because they give me another picture of a way to think about other things, right? So more for later.
Okay.
I'll do that later. But this has been so great getting a chance to talk to you in the new year. And any last words?
Only, well, maybe on the John Walton thing. I think the reason why his work is so important is, and this is something I'd like to throw out to Paul Vanderklay, is that how we read scriptures is often started or indicated by how we read the first two chapters of Genesis. How you look at that tends to be a good indicator of how someone's going to read the whole rest of the Bible. So I think it's very important to spend some time trying to understand those first two chapters of Genesis.
which is probably why Jordan Peterson's lecture series has been so
Yeah.
widely watched, right? Millions and millions of people have watched those first 2 episodes of his. Yep. Okay, well, I'm going
All
to
right.
dig into John Walton a little bit more myself, although a lot of the people that I've been listening to lately have that same picture of the first few chapters not being scientific, but telling a different story. And they certainly, if you go back and look at the old Hebrew, you not only get a different story, but you get something that's even deeper than science, I think. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Especially
the
when
fun
you
thing
look
that-
when you look into the underlying meaning of what it means when it talks about the chaos or the void, you get a much bigger picture than anything that science can give us. So,
Yeah, so that would be a good question for Paul Vanderklay as a pastor. Is when did our current interpretation of the Genesis story as being one of science come about? Because I had struggled, a young physics person, a Lutheran pastor introduced me to the work of Saint Athanasius. It's called On the Incarnation. I think you can find it on the web. It was written in the 4th century. And he compares the 3 different creation stories, the pagan, the Gnostic, and the Christian. And it's really interesting is that his take on from the 4th century is probably the most modern take I've ever encountered. And it's not what we hear from the church now. In fact, he made this statement that among the animals, God chose man for the special gift. And I thought, whoa. So clearly the early church did not read Genesis the way we traditionally look at it now. So when did the transition happen?
yeah, I think a lot of it may have come at the division between the East and the West, because a lot of the Eastern church fathers, like someone had said to me in some of my commentaries on Wolfram, they said, you need to go back and read St. Maximus on the Logoi, because it's very similar to Wolfram's theory.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I don't have a book, but I've been trying to just look into whatever articles I can find on St. Maximus and the Logoi. And these are obviously things that I have missed by being in the Protestant wing of things, because I haven't been getting that kind of early church father teaching. But I do notice that in our church recently, first of all, a lot of the leaders are starting to get beards. And they're starting to talk about the early church fathers. So I think there's a movement. I don't know how much of that has come about because of Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pajot, and how much of it's just organic, but there is a movement, at least in the church I go to, which is a non-denominational church.
Yeah, that's interesting, because those first few centuries of the Christian faith are usually left out of most of our church background. And I think one of the reasons why is because it's so messy. And it could get a bit ugly. And so people just like, we don't want to talk about that. But it was the period in time when our faith was growing and becoming what it is now. And so it's important to go back and look to see the forces that were at play and the decisions made. And that's when I discovered that the classic Greek language of the time was actually richer literarily than our modern English, so that they were conducting debates at a level we can't even begin to appreciate in English.
Yeah. Whenever I look back at the Greek, the depth of what I'm reading just exponentiates. It's really amazing.
And the classic heresies that came and were put down, I see are coming full force again in the mainline Protestants. And I think
I mean, when you talk about messy, I mean, what we've got right now is messy.
Yeah.
It's just not as deep a messy as the messy that they had back then.
Yeah, but that's the old story. You forget your history and then you repeat it. So
yeah.
Okay.
Well,
with
this
that
is
note,
great. Well, have a great week. I hope that your week gets better and better as time goes on. We're in
hope
a
so.
new year, and may 2022 be preferable to 2021. I guess
Yeah,
we
now
don't
I
have
have
any
to
choice
remember
at
to-
this point.
Yeah. Well, take care.
Okay.
And thanks for the conversation.
Yeah. Thanks.
Bye now.
Thanks, Glenn. Bye-bye.